assume that they had that at the end of the first half, they had that maybe make a more forward. It must have been that female.
I did see her. She was carrying a clipboard last night, but she was on. She was sometimes fine. I didn't see her. I couldn't see her walking off.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Is Ed around? Oh, Ed, you think we could make this a bit louder? Better. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 260th consecutive meeting of the Lexington Veterans Association. Don't ask me, counting back, how many years that is, but I think the first one occurred in the mid-1980s, before my time. But it's been going on a long time. You were in high school then. I was in high school then. And we thank you for helping us continue the tradition and keep this group so alive and so flourishing. I'm Linda Dixon from the Executive Committee. It's our pleasure to welcome you. We have an old favorite with us today, Professor Dan Breen from Brandeis University. Just as a quick question, how many people have heard Dan Breen speak in the past? Dan, you have some followers here. You have a pep club. Well, he's a frequent speaker in Lexington and Bedford. He hasn't been with us in a while, and we're just thrilled to have him back. And I will introduce him momentarily. But first, as we always do, may I ask everyone to rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Jim Ramsey will come forward and he will lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag, the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Jim. Glad you enjoyed the coffee. We're so happy that Starbucks of Lexington Center continues to generously donate the coffee. Many people brought in baked goods today. Thank you so much. Jerry always brings us something. Many others. Thank you, and thank you for your contributions of cash, because anything in that basket this month assures that we have cake and cookies next month. I would like to just bring up Sophia Ho again. As you know, Sophia is very active. She's in charge of a certain segment that will take place on Martin Luther King Day, 1 week from today, January 21. And it involves a major collection effort for the veterans at the Bedford Green Housing Complex at the Bedford VA Hospital. And if you look at the table against the wall, there's been an outpouring of generosity from this group, which is really overwhelming. Sophia, where are you? Come on up.
Thank you, Linda. You're always helpful, always urging people to give, and we really appreciate it. And look at the goodies. And I don't know how Pat's going to pack in her car and deliver, but she will. Thank you so much. I just would like to remind you that next Monday at Auditorium of Brookhaven, we have an event for gathering of seniors. All are invited. Please come, and if you can, please sign up, because there might be instructions I have to notify all of you. It's very easy. It's lexingtonmlk.org. follow the sign up and you're going to find us, and please sign up. Thank you very much. I hope to see many of you next Monday. Thanks again for your generosity. Thank you.
Just as a matter of practicality, there's a lot of loot there, and Pat and Sophia are delicate ladies. They're going to need some help carting all that stuff out and loading it into their car. Do you think we could have 2 or 3 volunteers to help bring that stuff out to their car? 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Thank you. After the program, don't you go away. Remember, you volunteered. Thank you. We appreciate it very much. And so do Sophia and Pat. Okay, let's get on with the program. I want to introduce our speaker a little formally now, just to remind you of the background of what we're going to talk about today and who's going to talk. So we're going to learn about the Gettysburg Address. Well, the Gettysburg Address is arguably the most popular, the most memorized, the most quoted speech in American political history. Contrary to some historical lore, President Abraham Lincoln did not write this speech by jotting down a few notes on the back of an envelope on the train to Gettysburg. He put a little more thought into it than that. He knew this was an important opportunity to send a message to the whole country about the war that was still going on with no end in sight. And he took that opportunity to describe the reasons for the war and his vision of the new nation that would be created at the end of the war. Now, Dan Breen, to just tell you a little about him, Dan grew up in Atlanta, where he developed a passion for history in general and the Civil War in particular. He earned a BA in history from the University of Wisconsin and a law degree from the University of Georgia, and he practiced law for a little while. But then he decided that history was his passion. So he earned a master's degree in history from the University of Georgia and a PhD in history from Boston College. He began his teaching career here in Boston, first at Framingham State. And as an aside, I have just learned that Framingham State College had its roots right here in Lexington in what is now the Masonic Lodge. So there. Dan moved to Newbury College in Brookline before joining the faculty of Brandeis University, where he is senior lecturer in legal studies. Now, here to tell us how this little speech of 272 words, lasting less than 3 minutes, has helped to change the course of history. Please welcome Dan Breen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So can you hear me if I speak like that? Is that not so bad? Pretty good? Okay. And as I always like to say before gatherings like this, please don't be shy about going back up there to get some coffee or cookies. It's perfectly okay with me. You won't distract me. Everything will be fine. We're all very congenial here, so don't be at all reluctant to do that. So those are those famous 272 words up there. I don't know how easy it is for you to read the fine print. It's kind of small the way it is. But don't worry, we'll be getting back to that in just a little bit. But before we begin, I think it's worthwhile setting the scene a little bit for the Gettysburg Address. And of course, that means turning to the battlefield at Gettysburg. And here, it's worth reminding ourselves that the Battle of Gettysburg was, and probably always will be, the largest battle ever fought in North America. It took place over 3 days and produced 50,000 casualties. If you put North and South together, 50,000 casualties, including a total of 7,000 combat deaths, give or take a few. One company of General Pettigrew's 26th North Carolina Regiment went into the battle on the first day with 89 men and came out with only 2 alive and uninjured. Let's see if I can turn this on properly. Here we go. They were fighting about there on the first day. And it's also worth remembering, while we're at it, that on the second day of the battle, always significant to me, by the way, because July 2nd is my birthday, but on the second day of the battle, with Alabama and Georgia regiments poised to break the Union line on Cemetery Ridge down there, a desperate charge, famous at the time, of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, consisting of 262 electives, was successful at the cost of 215 of them killed or wounded. The carnage continued on the 3rd day, when Pickett's charge, having been preceded by the greatest artillery bombardment of the Civil War, advancing at the standard rate of 100 yards per minute in the teeth of Union fire against Cemetery Ridge, produced 5,000 casualties, almost half of Pickett's entire force. Whole books have been written not just about the Battle of Gettysburg, but about individual incidents in the Battle of Gettysburg, among them not just Pickett's charge, but the Iron Brigade stand in the unfinished railroad cut near McPherson's Ridge up here on the first day, the Louisiana Tigers' fruitless attacks on Culp's Hill during day number 2 and day number 3, the epic clash of Maine and Alabama on Little Round Top on the second day, and since we're Massachusetts people, we might as well also mention the 2nd Massachusetts, which fought desperately here in Culp's Hill on the 3rd day. They were ordered to go in against the Confederates who had just mounted an unsuccessful charge. So as a counterattack, the 2nd Massachusetts was ordered in. Colonel Mudge, their commander, famously turned to a subordinate and said, "It's murder, but it's an order." As many officers could have said the same thing over the 1,000 years of military history immediately preceding Gettysburg. So in they went. The regiment was cut apart. Colonel Mudge, who was class of 1860 at Harvard College, was killed in the process. And I wondered if anybody knew, was Mudge Way named after him? Colonel Mudge, Mudge Way in Bedford? I kind of think it was.
Where the library is.
The library is, so probably Mudge Way was. So Colonel Mudge was killed on the 3rd day. The battle was horrific. The battle was terrible. But it was not without its, I think my microphone just went off. Can you still hear me? Okay. It was not without its amusing little anecdotes. So on the 2nd day of the battle, over here, out in that neighborhood, General Sickles, who had very badly arranged his men forward of Cemetery Ridge where they had no business being, General Sickles was in the teeth of the combat on the 2nd day. A Confederate cannonball landed near his horse, took off most of his leg. He fell from the horse. You could obviously see the thigh bone protruding from what had been his leg. And his subordinate actually went to him and said, "General, are you hurt?" That's maybe the funniest moment of this horrible battle. But when the battle was over, Lee, as we all know, had no choice but to retreat back across the Potomac. Never again would the Army of Northern Virginia amount anything like any mass invasion of the North. No sooner was Lee gone than Governor Curtin, famous governor of Pennsylvania, friend of Lincoln, decided that there had to be some kind of a formal cemetery at Gettysburg. And he wanted a very special person to organize it and put it together. And that was David Wills, maybe the leading citizen of Gettysburg at the time and a very close acquaintance of Governor Curtin. Wills was 34 years old, and his job now was to see to the burial of thousands of Union soldiers whose corpses were left on the field and buried in shallow graves with just a little wooden marker over the grave to mark who they were. You obviously couldn't leave them lying there. What you needed was a permanent cemetery. Wills saw right away that the only thing to do was to lay out a grand cemetery here, right by Cemetery Hill, near the official Gettysburg Town Cemetery, which had been there for about 20 years before the Battle of Gettysburg. That was where Pickett's charge had reached its apogee. That was where the height of the fighting was on the 3rd day, and that's where the cemetery would go. And he also knew by this time that the cemetery had to be kind of like what they already had in our own neighborhood. And I saw or heard some of you talk about this just about a half hour ago. It was going to be inspired by Mount Auburn Cemetery, right here in the neighborhood in Watertown. Because by this time, the old idea that a cemetery where you would put bodies would mostly be in churchyards surrounded by towns and cities was beginning to go by the wayside, giving way to the romantic notion that cemeteries should be park-like settings where people could go, commune with the graves, commune with the dead, and achieve a certain profound sense of what it means to live and die. And that would be good for the living, and it would be very respectful to the dead as well. So here's Joseph Story, our own Joseph Story, talking about how wonderful it would be in this new age of garden park cemeteries that would encourage contemplation and not fear. Here's what Story said at the dedication of Mount Auburn, the inspiration for the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Why should we, Joseph Story had said at the dedication of Mount Auburn, deposit the remains of our friends in loathsome vaults or beneath the gloomy crypts and cells of our churches where the human foot is never heard? Here, beneath the lofty oak, the rustling pine, and the weeping willow, we shall ever be instructed that the wintry blasts of death kills not the buds of virtue. And in a setting like this, a beautiful park to encourage people to come, to see, to commune with the spirits of those who are no longer with us, the Union dead will be permanently interred, moved from the shallow graves that litter the battlefield to a brand new place right there on Cemetery Hill. But not the Confederate dead. They, for the most part, would remain in their shallow graves until after the war, when the new states of the South, readmitted to the Union, would eventually claim them for various local cemeteries around the South. They never got all the bodies, as far as we know. As recently as 1995, they found a body that had never been found to be reinterred anywhere, and there are probably others still there if you cared to go look. And so Wills hired contractors to do the reburials. Now it's going to be a very big job to get the cemetery together, beginning in the summer of 1863. It's going to cost $1.59 per corpse to reinter them to the brand new cemetery. Luckily, Wills and Curtin were able to get the federal government to pick up most of the tab for this. The government was going to pay for the coffins at least, but the individual states were going to pay for the actual reburials of the soldiers. And the way it worked was that every state would have the responsibility of paying for that amount of the cemetery equivalent to their proportion of electoral college votes. So the bigger the state, the more they would have to pay for the Gettysburg National Cemetery. It wasn't quite fair. The state of Illinois only lost 6 dead in the Battle of Gettysburg, but they had to pay the same amount for the cemetery as Massachusetts. We lost 158. Maybe not that fair, but nobody complained at the time. Kind of thing you don't really want to complain about. And eventually the money was raised. We got a really good designer for it by late August, and the work began. It was designed and laid out in record time. All they needed by November was the formality of a dedication. And the only thing everybody knew in the summer of 1863, when Wills was putting all this together, he hired the designer, he hired the workmen, now he's going to put the ceremony together for the dedication of the cemetery. The only thing everybody knew was there was only one guy you had to have there, and we all knew who it was, the great Edward Everett. There he is, Edward Everett. And I just want to say a couple words about the great Edward Everett. Hardly anybody ever talks about Edward Everett without saying the great Edward Everett while they're bringing up Edward Everett. Edward Everett was the greatest orator of the middle of the 19th century in the United States, outdoing even Daniel Webster while Everett was still alive. Listen to all these facts about Dorchester's own Edward Everett. Not only did he graduate first in his class at Harvard at the age of 16, not only did he go on to become the very first American ever to get a PhD, not only was he at one time or another governor of Massachusetts, president of Harvard, secretary of state, member of the House of Representatives, ambassador to Great Britain, United States senator. Not only that, but he was also a fluent speaker of many languages, including ancient Greek, and a minister of the gospel to boot. He holds the distinction, by the way, of losing one of the closest elections in American history. In 1839, the Massachusetts governor's election, Everett got 50,725. His opponent got 51,034. So it's a difference of just a little over 100 votes. Now, he was so diligent in his habits. He had to be to accomplish all this. He was so diligent in his habits that Edward Everett's nickname was Edward Ever At It. Edward Ever At It. The only job he ever failed at was president of Harvard. And the reason he failed at that job was he actually wanted to enforce the disciplinary rules, make sure everybody was back at the dorms when they should have been. And the kids didn't like that much, so they actually burned out his office. So this was long before the 1960s. They're burning out the president's office at Harvard. And Everett quite sensibly figured maybe this isn't quite the job for me, and he went on to something else. Now, Edward's talents as an orator were legendary. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that his voice was the most mellow and beautiful and correct of all the instruments he had ever heard. And that meant that David Wills asked him, without even having to think about it, to speak at the dedication in November. The invitation to Everett was extended in late August, and Everett said, I can fit it into my schedule, November 19th, that will be fine. So while work at the cemetery was just beginning, Edward Everett was going to be the speaker. It was not until November 2nd, and by that time, they'd gotten a lot of the bodies interred at the cemetery. They knew they had to work quickly, about 100 bodies a day, because they had to make it before the first frosts in probably going to be mid to late November. But they had almost everybody in by early November. And it was not until November 2nd, 17 days before the dedication ceremony, that Wills wrote a letter to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, asking him to attend the ceremony, the dedication, and speak, quote, a few appropriate remarks, unquote. And it was not at all certain that Lincoln would go. The fact was, he had every reason to stay. For one thing, that second week in November, when he was thinking about it, his son Tad got desperately ill. And as we all know, the Lincolns had suffered a terrible tragedy in February of 1862 when their youngest son, Willie, died. Almost drove Mary insane, came close to driving Lincoln to complete despair. And now Tad, their second youngest son, was sick. Surely Lincoln's place was there at the White House. He had every reason to turn down the invitation. And then the other thing was, he never left Washington to make speeches. This would be very unusual for him to leave the White House and actually go somewhere to make a speech. If he wanted the country to know something that he was thinking of, he knew how to do it. He would write a letter to the editor of a newspaper, knowing that would be printed and reprinted all over the country. He'd write a letter to a given correspondent who he knew would put that in the paper, and that way it would get redistributed everywhere. And if he wanted to say something really big, he would wait till the December message to Congress, what we call the State of the Union. Back then, nobody went to Congress to deliver it. He just wrote a message, and Congress would hear it. And all over the country, it would be reprinted. There's all sorts of ways Lincoln found to communicate with the people, but he wouldn't actually leave Washington to make a speech. He'd leave now and then to talk to generals of the Army of the Potomac, but as far as making a speech, he just didn't do that. But this invitation he accepted. And before we go any further, a little trivia question. Who was the first president to actually go to Congress to deliver the State of the Union? And the answer is Wood.
Oh, no, I was going to say John Hanson, the first president of the United
There
States.
you. Oh, that's trick answer. No, so officially be Woodrow Wilson from and I think it was 1914 or 1913 when he delivered the first one. 1914 probably. Finally, Lincoln accepted the invitation, but he only accepted it 3 days before the 19th. He accepted it on November 16th, and it was only on November 16th that he really began to work on what would be the Gettysburg Address. So why did Lincoln decide to go to Gettysburg? Two reasons among many that we could bring up, I think were most important. The most important reason, I think, and most historians think, was that Lincoln really did want to see the battlefield. He was very curious about it. He, like everybody else, had read about it. He knew the incidents of the battle very well, and he wanted a chance to go see it. And the second reason was the battle, after all, had been a great victory. The battle had preserved the Union in the moment of one of its greatest crises, the summer of 1863. And maybe Lincoln welcomed this chance to align his administration through this ceremony with a victorious battle. Gettysburg, and what better way to align his administration with victory and the success of his war aims than to go himself to Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery and to get his whole cabinet to go with him. Lincoln wanted everybody there. He wanted the entire cabinet to get on the train with him and go to Gettysburg. And that will be a way, perhaps, to share in the glory of the battle won by the soldiers under Lincoln's ultimate command. It was so important to him to get there that he overrode Secretary of War Stanton's original plans about how they were all actually going to Gettysburg. Stanton's idea was to leave the morning of the dedication, November 19th. We'll just get on the train, 6 a.m., we'll be there easily right after noon, that's when you're going to speak, so let's do that. Lincoln right away said, quote, "I do not like this idea. I do not like this arrangement," unquote. And the reason was, and we all know this because we deal with the T, what if the thing's late? You got to depend this, everything's got to be on time, and if all the trains are on time, you'll be there on time. But it's a bad idea to just make a plan based upon the idea that all the trains are going to be on time. You had to leave Washington, you had to go to Baltimore, you had to change trains there, then you had to go to Gettysburg, another change of trains at Hanover Junction, Pennsylvania. What if something's late? So Lincoln said, I'm not going to be late to this. Absolutely not. It's the worst thing to be late to. So we're all going to leave on November 18th, the day before, not the morning of November 19th. By the time he got up in the morning on the 18th, and he's going to go get the train a little bit later in the morning, He knew what Everett was going to say. Everett had very thoughtfully sent Lincoln a copy of his speech, all 50 pages of it, because Everett didn't want Lincoln repeating something he was going to say. We didn't have to worry about that. That wasn't going to happen. Lincoln liked the speech. He read the speech. And he'd already seen a mock-up of the cemetery. Had a big model of the cemetery right in front of him that he actually got a chance to look at. So he knew just what the land was going to look like when he went to make the speech. So by that time, by November 18th, when he actually got on the train, he'd already been working on the speech for a couple days. And the first words of the speech for him were probably the easiest. The famous words, 7 years ago, our farthest part forth, and so forth, upon this continent. Now, the reason those words, that first sentence, was pretty easy for him was he already said something like that on July 7th, while making some impromptu remarks from the White House to a bunch of serenaders who were celebrating the twin victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. On that occasion, looking at this rather casual crowd that night, Lincoln had said, 80-odd years ago, our country had been founded on the self-evident assumption that all men are created equal. So he had said something like those first words before. And it was very natural on July 7th to think of the Battle of Gettysburg in light of the Declaration of Independence. It was only 3 days after July 4th. And those words meant something very important to Lincoln anyway. The self-evident assumption, as he put it then, that all men are created equal. As he had said back in Illinois in 1858, it was vitally important to understand that this country was founded not on blood, but on an ideal. On an idea that anybody could subscribe to, and the very fact of subscribing to it would make you as American as anybody could possibly be. So back in Illinois in 1858, Lincoln had made a speech, and he had said that these words, all men are created equal, the idea that defines the country, that's what makes newcomers from around the world just as American as those who could trace their ancestry back to the Mayflower. So when people from Germany, he said, and Ireland and Scandinavia look at that declaration, all men are created equal, Lincoln said, quote, they see those words, all men are created equal, and they find that that moral sentiment, not blood, but that moral sentiment links them to the founders. And that they have the right to claim that sentiment as if they are the blood of the flesh of the founders. And so they are, as American as anybody could possibly be. So those words were vital to him. Now, of course, in the address, the actual Gettysburg Address, as we all know, he doesn't use the word assumption that all men are created equal. What he says is the proposition that all men are created equal. And that word proposition for Lincoln had a special meaning. Because back when he was a young lawyer, when he wasn't reading Shakespeare, which he spent most of his time doing, he was devouring Euclid, the great Greek geometrician Euclid. And in Euclid, as some of you will know more than me, there are some things that are just true. Some things that you would be insane to doubt. For example, how many angles are there in a right triangle? Well, there are 3. But what do they all add up to in terms of the number of degrees?
180.
Very good, 180. You would be insane to doubt that the angles in a right triangle add up to 180. Those are axioms, they're just true. But there are some things that are a little bit different. Some things are propositions. And a proposition needs to be proven, needs to be demonstrated by experience. And for Lincoln, all men are created equal, that's a proposition. And the intention of the framers was to work that out, to demonstrate that by experience as time goes on. And it was a deep article of faith with Lincoln that even though so many of the founders were slaveholders, that they firmly believed as early as 1776 that over time, the institution of slavery would be put on a course to its ultimate destruction. That would happen. It couldn't happen in 1787 and it couldn't happen in 1776, but it would happen as an experiment demonstrating the truth of the proposition that all men are created equal. That's why the founders had barred slavery through the Old Northwest Ordinance in the area north of the Ohio, west of the Appalachians. That's why they had put the extinction of the slave trade provision in the original Constitution. That's why they had given Congress the power to make all rules and regulations for the new territories when they should be acquired. All of that part of what the framers, Lincoln believed, thought would be an experiment dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, dedicated to the slow abolition of slavery. The time had now come to make that proposition a reality. So it's a proposition that all men are created equal. And as we'll see in the Gettysburg Address, the war was the latest test of how that proposition would actually work in practice, and unfortunately in a practice bathed in blood. And it was also natural that Lincoln should use those two words, brought forth. Our fathers brought forth upon this continent a nation conceived in liberty. For while Lincoln was not at all religious, he didn't go to church, he had no great religious faith, kind of thought of himself as an agnostic, maybe an atheist. The fact was that, like everybody else who read English in the 19th century, Lincoln's prose and his very thoughts were heavily influenced by the cadences of the King James Version of the Bible. And as a voracious reader, even if you weren't actually reading the Bible, you couldn't avoid the influence of the King James Bible. And the King James Bible was permeated by the brought forth language. The book of Revelation speaks of a time when there shall be brought forth a man-child who shall rule all nations. And the Old Testament relates the story of Moses, who brought forth the Israelites from slavery. And of course, the very phrase, our fathers, echoes the Lord's Prayer. Now, those clear biblical allusions and sources to the very first sentence of the Gettysburg Address did not stop some unkind comments from the Democratic press who didn't like the words brought forth. They called it obstetrical language, obstetrical analogies. Kind of gross, they thought. But he was thinking biblically, of course. He was thinking along the cadences of the King James Version. So Lincoln continued working on his remarks 16th and 17th when he could. He was always busy. But off and on, he'd work on the remarks. And we think he got about 2/3 of the way through by the time it was time to board the train. So going back maybe a little bit to the actual address that I had earlier on the screen, he got about as far as there. It is for us the living. And he was kind of thinking about that language, had a little bit of it worked out. This part was complete, pretty much complete. This part he still has some work to do on. So it's mostly done by the morning of the 18th, but not quite. And it was then time to think about getting on the train. He just barely made it to the train in time. It was a 12 o'clock train, I think. Train finally left at 12:40, so he had to actually wait a while for him. But there he is, rushing to the train. He's rushing to try to get there. And the station master is right there by the train. Come on, Mr. President, come on, Mr. President, we're ready to go. And Lincoln told the station master a little bit later that the idea of being beckoned to his own train so he could actually get to Gettysburg reminded him of a story. Everything reminded Lincoln of a story. But this one reminded Lincoln of a story back in Illinois where there was a convict who was about to be executed. And the convict was being led to the place where the hangman's noose was, being led to the gallows. And while that was happening, a bunch of people were jostling past the convict because they wanted a good seat. They wanted a good seat by the gallows. And the convict kept yelling to them, don't worry, there's no hurry. Nothing good is going to happen until I get there. So you might have just walked. And that's the way Lincoln felt as he was trying to get to the train. Yeah. Now, as it turned out, not the entire cabinet was going to go. Seward went, Stanton went, I think Gideon Welles was there, but there was one really big exception to Lincoln's hope that the full cabinet would join him for the trip to Gettysburg, and that was Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, who was harboring dreams of replacing Lincoln on the Republican ticket in 1864. And Chase thought this would be a wonderful opportunity to stay here in Washington and talk to my friends about maybe getting the nomination from Lincoln. And the very idea that he would think that gives you a sense of his political antenna and how sharp it was. But eventually, Lincoln heard that that's why Chase had probably stayed back in Washington. Chase's friend Francis Spinner was so sure that Lincoln would not get the nomination and that Chase would in 1864, that Spinner noted to an acquaintance that Lincoln and Seward going to Gettysburg, that's the dead going to see the dead. And believe it or not, that remark did get back to Lincoln. He thought it was terribly funny that they would say something like that. Well, the train left afternoon to go to Gettysburg. Like I said, it was behind schedule by the time Lincoln got there. The trip was going to be 6 hours if all went well. Now, they had to change trains in Baltimore, as I said. And back then, what that meant was you had to get off the train at the station from Washington. Then you need to pack all your luggage on something and go to another station, which will take you further north and further west. Everybody knew that about Baltimore. A lot of cities were like that back then. Everybody in Massachusetts knew that because that's why the 6 Massachusetts have been set upon by the Baltimore mob in April of 1861 on their way to Washington. So Lincoln gets off the train along with everybody else. The baggage is being moved. And everybody knew by then he was going to be arriving in Baltimore. So the street was lined with spectators to see the president. We know that Lincoln kissed 3 babies on the way to the other train station that will actually take him to Gettysburg. And by the time they got on that train, the new train, more politicians had joined up to be with Lincoln and Seward, swapping stories and making plans for the 1864 race. And that's why Linda was correct to say Lincoln wasn't writing the Gettysburg Address on the train. He had no time to do that. He was swapping stories with Seward and signing stuff and talking to people and politicking. So no time to work on the speech. Finally, at 6 p.m., the train pulled into Gettysburg in the fading light of that autumn afternoon, November 18th. There were only 2,400 people in the entire town of Gettysburg. So by that evening, the place was bursting with visitors that dwarfed the permanent residents. Perhaps 20,000 people had gathered for the ceremony the next day to hear mostly what Everett had to say. Luckily, Lincoln didn't have to worry about trying to find a place to stay because this is where he stayed. I bet many of you have been to Gettysburg, and that's David Will's house, one of the nicest houses in Gettysburg, right on the main square, which they still call the Diamond to this day. So Lincoln was going to have a room where he could sleep that night in David Will's house. He gave a little speech to a bunch of semi-drunken revelers, I think at like 8:30 or 9 that night. And then he finally had time to go work on his speech. Remember, he still had about a third of it left to write. By that time, by 10 p.m., he's upstairs finishing the Gettysburg Address. And he could do it pretty well by then because one big distraction was now resolved. Waiting for him at David Will's house was a telegram from Mary Todd Lincoln saying that Tad is out of danger. There's no reason to worry. So now Lincoln didn't have that on his mind. So he could work on the speech without probably something he was very concerned about weighing him down. By that time, going back to the speech itself for just a while, as we saw earlier, he had already talked about what he thought of the nation's past. A nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he had already talked about the nation's present. We are now engaged in a civil war that will decide whether that proposition or any other like proposition can be sustained. So like I said, he got down about here, talking about how although we're meant to dedicate this battlefield very memorably, it's beyond our poor power to do that. Those who died here, who gave their last measure of devotion, have done that beyond our poor power to do so. So he talked about the past and the present, testing the proposition whether a nation conceived of liberty can long endure. And now all he had to do was talk about or finish up his thoughts for what the battle and the war meant for the nation's future. He seems to have labored over the ending for the speech for about an hour until he finally got something he could live with. He had the phrase "New Birth of Freedom" and the memorable ending of the speech, "Government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that would now not perish from the earth," he hoped. I think every word to the draft was his, except maybe for one, although we don't know. And that was this one, perish. And maybe Lincoln had written something like disappear. That might have been his original thought. But we think he might have shown the speech to Seward, and Seward might have suggested perish and not disappear. We're not totally sure about that. But the fact is that Lincoln almost never used the word perish. Seward did all the time, but Lincoln usually didn't. We know he showed the speech to Seward, and maybe that was Seward's addition, that word perish. But again, we can't be totally sure of that at this distance. So by 11 o'clock, 11:30, he was ready to go to bed. And the speech was done except for 2 things that were going to change the next day. And we'll get to those in a second. But before anything was going to change in the speech, remember, one of the main reasons Lincoln went to Gettysburg was he wanted to see the battlefield. So early the next morning, he was an early riser, he had no problem getting up. So he got up a little bit after sunrise, got a guide together, got Seward up, and they decided to ride out to see a bit of the battlefield. And specifically, because the ceremony was not going to begin until 10, they figured they had plenty of time. So they rode out to the spot that Lincoln really wanted to see. And that was the spot near the Lutheran Seminary, which is right up here. There's the seminary, right there, on what would always be known as Seminary Ridge. He wanted to see that spot near the seminary because that's where his friend General Reynolds had been killed. So we'll go back to that spot here. Lincoln knew Reynolds and deeply admired Reynolds. This is the old dorm at the Lutheran Seminary. That was the lookout spot where at one time Reynolds was looking out to the west, looking at the approaching Confederates on the first day of the battle. Now Lincoln really wanted to see that spot he thought very highly of General Reynolds, because in the crisis of June 1863, after Chancellorsville, after Hooker had been fired from his command as commander of the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln had offered the command to Pennsylvania's General Reynolds. And Reynolds had very graciously stepped aside and said, no, more appropriately, the command should go to Meade, my fellow Pennsylvanian. And that's how General Meade got command of the Army of the Potomac. And it was Reynolds, on the first day of the battle, July 1st, 1863, who had insisted that the line here by the seminary be held as long as possible, so that the rest of the Union Army could have time to come up behind and occupy the really good defensive ground on Cemetery Ridge. But that was not going to happen unless Seminary Ridge and part of McPherson's Ridge originally were held by the thin line of troopers who were there from the First Corps. It was Reynolds who had sent the Iron Brigade into the thick of the battle in a desperate attempt to hold the line against superior advancing Confederates. If Reynolds had not made that decision, the high ground and back would not have been held. There would have been no Battle of Gettysburg on the second and third day. But the decision was made. The Iron Brigade memorably was sent into the last great combat in their storied existence, in which they lost so many of their members in the unfinished railroad cut. And as he was sending the Iron Brigade in, including the famous 6th Wisconsin, Reynolds yelled, "Forward, men! Forward, for God's sake, and drive those fellows out of the woods!" Only at that precise moment to be shot off his horse, killed while still in his 30s, a mere 50 yards from the Confederate line. His wife then entered a convent where she spent the rest of her life. So Lincoln was guided to the spot where Reynolds had died. And when he got there, he looked around at the panorama of the battlefield spread out before him. He turned around, looking east. The town of Gettysburg would be on his left. Forward and to the right was Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, where much of the fighting had been. He was told by his guide, as he looked around, that near the spot where he was standing, one of the most famous of the Gettysburg veterans, John Burns, remember the man of Gettysburg, the veteran of the War of 1812, had, despite his advanced years, showed up on Seminary Ridge on the first day with an old flintlock musket and asked to be of service any way he could, even though he was, I think, in his early 80s when he did that. John Burns fought in the battle, was wounded 3 times before they allowed him to go, before he actually consented to go back and seek care in Gettysburg. So when he stood there a little while looking around, he decided to make a couple changes to the speech. We think that's where he was thinking about it. Because he went back to the Wills house after being on Seminary Ridge, and he insisted on going back to his room and working some more on the speech that probably before he went out to Seminary Ridge he probably thought was done. And he changed 2 things. And here's what he changed. We'll get back to the speech here so we can be a bit more careful about it. First of all, the famous words here, "The world will little note nor will remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." Very significantly, he underlined "did" on his copy of the speech, what they did here. Because looking out over the battlefield, where you could still see shallow graves, at least of the Confederates, in various places, I think what really forcefully appeared to Lincoln was the sheer enormity and horror of that sacrifice. The world can never forget what they did here, what these soldiers did here. And then the other thing he changed, down here, a little bit further on, "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us." The original draft said, "It is rather for us who stand here to pursue the great task remaining before us." And "for us who stand here" just refers to people at the ceremony, just refers to people in the audience. But something about the sheer overwhelming impact of seeing the battlefield and thinking about the dead led him to change it from the static sense of stand, limited only to the people who would be on Cemetery Hill in just a couple hours, to a broader, more encompassing idea. It is rather for us to living as a whole, all of us, everybody in the country. It is for us to living rather to be dedicated to the unfinished work, to the great task remaining here before us. So by using the word dedicated there, not just to pursue, but to be dedicated to, he aligns the generation of 1863, and in fact all Americans, to the generation of 1776, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So what was a small idea, we who stand here should take increased devotion to this cause, became a larger, more magnanimous ideal. All of us should be dedicated to the great task before us. So those are the two changes he made after standing near the spot where General Reynolds died. Very important change indeed. Because when you think about being dedicated to the new birth of freedom, those words that Lincoln had settled on the night before, what that meant, anybody would have seen in 1863, the new birth of freedom that we now had to be dedicated to, based upon what we owe to this shattered generation, was in fact the complete eradication, not just of African slavery, but of inequality in American life as a whole. The great task before us referred not just to the war, but also to everything Lincoln and his administration were beginning to do to make African equality with other Americans something close to a reality. Not just the Emancipation Proclamation, but also the eradication of slavery in the District of Columbia, which had already been done, the program of compensated emancipation in the free states, which was proceeding apace by 1863, black soldiers in the Union Army, also with the promise to pay them equally, which Lincoln was going to make that December. All of it part of what he thought was actually the new birth of freedom that we had to dedicate ourselves to. Not just the survival of the country, but a genuine commitment to making equality a reality. All men are created equal. Now with that done, with the speech ready, finally he was ready to go to the ceremony. So we will turn now just to a couple slides regarding that moment. There's the seminary again. And this is a little bit what the ceremony looked like on November 19th, 1863. The way it worked was Lincoln got on his horseback. Now it's about 10 o'clock in the morning. And he followed a procession of about 1,000 soldiers and dignitaries of various sorts, marching from Gettysburg down the Taneytown Road towards Cemetery Hill. He kissed one girl on the way. He enjoyed the applause of the crowd, but then things got somber the closer they got to Cemetery Hill, where the cemetery was. There was a 3-foot platform that they had erected here in the view. There's the old arch where the old cemetery was. And Lincoln, and the platform was about there. That's where the ceremony was going to be. There were 3 chairs that Lincoln was directed to. He would sit in the middle, Seward on his left, and Everett on his right. Seward sat down, Lincoln sat down. There's no Everett. Where's Everett? He's the one everybody wants to see. Then Everett sheepishly arrived. He told Lincoln, I've been answering the calls of nature. That took a while. I don't know why you'd be interested in it, but there's what the calls of nature were, that tent right there. So then Everett sat down. Then there was an invocation, very long invocation as it turned out. Then there was a funeral dirge. And then, in complete silence, Mr. Everett spoke or began to speak. He got up, he bowed to Lincoln, the president, and then he began his 2-hour speech. Standing here beneath this serene sky, overlooking these broad fields, now reposing from the labors of the waning year, the mighty Alleghanies dimly towering over us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet, it is with hesitation that I lift my voice to break the eloquence of God in nature. He wasn't that reluctant. Then 2 hours go by, and it was a really superb speech. It was a great speech. Everybody loved the speech. You might have heard stories about people were bored. Nobody was bored at the ceremony. People paid attention. He described the Gettysburg campaign very thoroughly, in great detail. He made a couple of little mistakes, like he went into 16th New York, and he said 113th, and the officers were, no, but you got the name wrong. But he only made one big mistake, because at one point during the speech, he wanted to talk about General Meade, and he actually said General Lee, instead of General Meade, and Lincoln piped up, Meade, you mean Meade. So Lincoln was paying attention, because he means Meade, not Lee. Everett had reread, in Greek of course, because he was Everett, Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. So in writing the speech, he had all these Greek allusions, talked about Pericles, talked about episodes with Athens fighting Sparta. Very, very, very scholarly speech. Talked about the Greek wars of independence, not just against the Persians, but also in the 1820s and 1830s. And he finally gestured towards the graves and ended with a sentence that went on for more than half of the length of the Gettysburg Address. Went on for 150 words, and that was the last sentence. And the last phrase, and the last sentence was, "The whole earth is a sepulchre of illustrious men. All time is the millennium of their glory." And he sat down. The crowd, who enjoyed every minute of it, greeted him with a thunderous ovation. And Lincoln liked the speech too. And he was obviously paying attention, but by this time, there he is sitting next to Seward, waiting to go up. And he was beginning to feel bad. He was beginning to feel queasy, because just last night, especially this morning, he was feeling symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as smallpox. And in fact, what he had was variola, what they used to call a mild version of smallpox. And he was already not feeling good. He had a fever, his back was beginning to hurt. So he was feeling it a little bit that morning, that early afternoon. But eventually he was kind of happy to get smallpox, as he told one of his associates. Now, for the first time, finally, I've got something I can give everybody. But by the time he actually got up to speak, it was 2 p.m. when he finally was asked to visit the platform once Everett was done. And the sun was out on a beautiful November day of 52 degrees. And you can see it on the screen there. So Lincoln was about there. That's where he's going to speak. There's the old cemetery. And there's the new flagpole just to the left, just to the south of the old cemetery. It's not there anymore, but they had put it up there not long after the battle. And that was the biggest thing you could see anywhere in the landscape then, the new flagpole. By the way, I forgot to mention, one thing about Everett's speech that a lot of people don't know is he's the first one to use the phrase Little Round Top. So anybody who reads about the Battle of Gettysburg, you'll know about the fighting at Little Round Top with Colonel Chamberlain then in the 20th Maine. Well, nobody in Gettysburg ever called that Little Round Top. Everett thought that would be a good name for it. So I put in the speech Little Round Top, and it's been a Little Round Top ever since. So now it's 2 p.m., as I said. Lincoln got up, began to speak 77 years ago. It took longer to make the speech than you'd think, because he kept getting interrupted with applause. When he pronounced the phrase, "They can never forget what they did here," an officer in the crowd even shouted, "God bless Mr. Lincoln." He ended with the famous words, "Government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." Words that would have been perfectly familiar to everybody in the audience that day on Cemetery Hill, because they recalled directly Daniel Webster's words in what was until then the most famous speech in American history, the reply to Hayne in 1831. Because Daniel Webster in that speech had used the phrase, "Government made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people." Lincoln could do no better, he thought, than to quote his hero Webster's famous phraseology at the end of this speech. So when he was done, after having gone on for just a few minutes, of course, there was sustained applause, and then it was time to sit back down for the closing benediction. The minister had his say, the Marine band began to play, and then it was time to go. Lincoln paused. He shook hands with nobody except the wounded veterans. He made sure he shook their hands. They were very close to the stage. And then he went to a short service at the Presbyterian Church, closer into downtown Gettysburg, said goodbye to Wills, thank you for being such a good host, and got on the train back to Washington. Felt worse and worse and worse all the way, and he was, by the time he got back to the city, very sick indeed, and he would spend most of the next 3 weeks in bed trying to get over the variola. But he had the satisfaction of hearing Everett say what a great little speech Lincoln had given, and reports of the speech around the North were generally quite favorable. Most people, especially Republican papers, really seemed to like the speech, but there were some notes of dissent. Not everybody liked it, because in 1863, even though maybe a lot of people don't think of it this way when we read it, in 1863, everybody knew what Lincoln was talking about in that speech. Because I briefly alluded to this earlier. Short as it was, the Gettysburg Address contained two major big ideas. And one of them was something Lincoln had been saying all along. He said that when he was running for the Senate in Illinois, he said that especially in the first inaugural. One big idea was Lincoln's concept that you could never have a republic. A republic, of course, was the only kind of government that made sense. If you really think that all men are created equal, everybody's got to have an equal vote, everybody's got an equal say, at least in choosing leaders. But a republic can never last at all. It's something that will never work if one side of the republic can just walk away from it when they don't like an election result. The war for him, especially at the beginning, was about making sure that republics could last. A republic that cared enough about all men are created equal, about its founding ideals, to fight for it when one part of it wants to break away, was a republic that was not only fighting for itself, but for the very idea of democratic government. So for Lincoln, the war had to mean that republics can last. You don't destroy a republic just by walking away when you don't like the election. The rest of it has got to fight for it and preserve it to show that you can have democratic rule. Otherwise, republics would just keep splitting apart and splitting apart and splitting apart, just as they had in the ancient world. It was now up to us to show a republic can defend itself when one part of it wants to go away. Lincoln had never thought that secession was legal. He always thought it was unconstitutional, and he always thought it had to be opposed. Otherwise, how could you ever have a functioning republic? So the war tested the proposition that you could have a functioning government based on the proposition that all men are created equal. That much was clear. But then there was that other idea, the more revolutionary one, the more radical one. When he used the phrase new birth of freedom, which is a phrase he never used before, the phrase new birth of freedom, he was talking about the need not just to end slavery, but to entertain the possibility of full black citizenship, which Dred Scott had said was unconstitutional. No, the war had to be about something better, a new birth of freedom, considered not just along political lines, but also, and maybe more especially, along racial lines. New birth of freedom in which all men are created equal actually means something for everybody, at least all males in the middle of the 19th century. Now, when Northern papers criticized the speech, which a lot of them did, they knew what Lincoln was talking about. They criticized the speech precisely because they knew that it was all about, or largely about, the idea of Negro equality, as it was called, which one Democratic paper called a miserable falsehood, a miserable falsehood. So that generation knew the radical nature of this speech. But a few weeks after that commentary, most people forgot about the Gettysburg Address. It's hard to imagine now, but in the generation after the war, hardly anybody quoted it. Hardly anybody referred to it. Only beginning in 1888, when they commemorated the 25th anniversary of the battle, did people begin to resurrect the Gettysburg Address. People began to speak it as part of the commemoration. It became included in McGuffey's Reader so that all American school children might be exposed to it who were going to school. But in a real sense, even then, as it entered the public consciousness in the 1890s, in the first part of the 20th century, even then, in a real sense, the speech remained forgotten. Because when teachers and politicians talked about the Gettysburg Address, usually what they meant, or usually what they said Lincoln meant by new birth of freedom, was simply the nation coming together again. Simply a nation reunifying. Not African equality, not racial equality, but the nation coming back together again. That's what they said new birth of freedom meant. So in 1913, when there was a great reunion at Gettysburg among not just Union veterans, but also Confederate veterans in 1913, when over 50,000 veterans from both sides of the war would gather in town to hear speeches and build bonfires and watch fireworks, the idea of what new birth of freedom was supposed to be was completely lost in the shuffle, Lincoln's original idea. Among those who attended, by the way, that 50th anniversary celebration in 1913 was none other than General Sickles, whose incompetent dispositions on the second day of the battle accounted for the fighting in Devil's Den in the Peach Orchard. As many of you know, Sickles would often go to visit his leg, which was put in a museum. I think it's still in Pennsylvania, right? So he got around despite his injury. Now, for this big 50th anniversary, they had a big tent built at Gettysburg. They could have 13,000 chairs in that tent for people to hear speeches. The people putting on the anniversary celebration with all those veterans arriving for the reunion, they hired 2,000 cooks. 2,000 cooks just for those several days. They dug 90 latrines. They had their own post office. And they also had their own morgue, just in case somebody should die at the festivities, which in fact 9 people did, which is not surprising because it was 100 degrees, so heat stroke was a problem. The theme, though, was reconciliation, not remembering the radical nature of what Lincoln was thinking about. And in fact, this is true, 2 veterans, one north, one south, actually went into Gettysburg and they bought a hatchet and they went out to the battlefield and they buried it together. They actually buried the hatchet. To me, the most heartwarming element of the great reunion of 1913, though, was when veterans of General Buford's brigade, they were the first Union troops in action on McPherson's Ridge early on the first day. To get to McPherson's Ridge, they had to go through Gettysburg. And they never forgot, those young guys in their late teens and 20s, how the ladies of Gettysburg had come out and cheered them and thrown flowers at them. They never forgot how happy that made them and how confident they made them. So in 1913, some of those veterans from Buford's brigade, they went into Gettysburg and they wanted to try to find those girls. And they've actually found 6 of them. We're now in their 60s and 70s. And they told them, I can't believe we found you. Thank you so much for what you did. And there was not a dry eye anywhere near as the ladies began to sing Rally Around the Flag one last time for the young guys they had last seen 50 years before. President Wilson stood up to make his speech at the reunion, and he simply said that we can all be grateful that the war had reunified the country, and that all that was to be done now was to commemorate the memory of the bravery shown by both sides. But no one talked about the failures of Reconstruction. Nobody talked about the bitterly and tragically unfinished work of racial equality that the war had left in its wake. Nobody talked about the rebirth of segregation, the lack of voting rights. Nobody talked about the shameful legacy of the war when, although slavery was eradicated, the whole idea of equality had been lost in political and social shuffles. The new birth of freedom, the way Lincoln had thought about it, seemed to be forgotten. And Walt Whitman, this is why I have this screen up. Walt Whitman, who was a nurse in the war, as you know, famously said that war is 1 part glory and 999 parts diarrhea. And he was right about that. The war was a terrible thing. The battle was a terrible thing. Everybody on Cemetery Hill knew that, if they had any association with it. It was so terrible, and the sacrifices so great, those 3 days in Gettysburg especially, that Lincoln insisted that the world never forget what they did here, even if it forgot what he said there. But I think he was exactly wrong. Most people have never heard, unfortunately, of General Reynolds in the 6th Wisconsin, in the 2nd Massachusetts, and those who sacrificed on Cemetery Ridge and Devil's Den and Little Round Top, and the rest of the landmarks of Gettysburg. But beyond that, most people don't really understand or truly dedicate themselves to that idea of the new birth of freedom, to make sure all men are created equal becomes a progressive, enduring, and eventual reality. And I would suggest that if we want to remember the Gettysburg Address, we dedicate ourselves again to thinking about what new birth of freedom can really mean for us all, so that they will not have died in vain, and that these stones will carry with them the enduring meaning that the generation of 1863 had hoped they would. And so with that, I'll close and ask if anybody has any questions.
Before we accept questions, we just want to know, want everybody to know that Dan has signed on to do a series of lectures in Bedford. Tell us when.
Beginning January 27th, I'll be giving a series of lectures on the Indian Wars. So I'm going to begin with the Shawnee War of the early 1790s, and I'll be ending with the Sioux Wars and the Nez Perce Wars. So those begin January 27th, 2 o'clock at the main library in Bedford.
And they're
On Mudge Way.
Right?
On Mudge Way, named
Mudge
after,
Way.
we think, Colonel Mudge.
And it's once a week?
Every Sunday except the President's Day Sunday.
Every Sunday.
For
Okay.
5 or 6 weeks.
I think maybe 5. I could go 6.
Great. Okay, so maybe we can make our way there. All right, who's going to ask the first question?
Any question at all.
Tom.
If I can answer, somebody will.
And then who had your hand up?
2 questions. First question, Everett, Mass. Is it named for Edmund Everett?
It's named after him.
Named after him.
Yeah.
Is he from there, or what's his tie to that area?
No, he was from Dorchester. Yeah,
Oh.
grew up in Dorchester. But some of you may know Everett was splitting from Chelsea, was it?
Okay.
So they needed something to name it, so they named it Everett because he was so well known. I think that's the way it worked.
Second question, what was Lincoln's thought on the speech after he gave it?
He was very pleased with it. He had told Seward that he thinks that he put the thoughts he wanted in the language that he really wanted. So he, as a matter of craftsmanship, was quite happy with it. And the thing that made him happiest was when he got really sincere praise from Edward Everett. Edward Everett wrote him a letter truthfully saying, and I think Linda quoted this, right, in your materials, that Lincoln said more in just those 272 words than he had said in his whole speech, or something like that. And he was sincere in his praise, and that meant a lot to Lincoln, who really looked up to Everett. But he was happy with it, yes.
Next question here.
Yes, the chronicling of the speech that you gave, at different parts being written at different times, were there notes made where you could actually trace?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the one. And just let me ask, second is, the fighters on the field, well, they were dead afterwards, obviously, but did they think about the rebirth?
No. What do you mean?
Well, going into the battle, were they thinking in terms of rebirth?
Some of them were.
You think so?
Yeah, sure. There were almost 100,000 Union troops anywhere near Gettysburg. I'm sure they all had their own thoughts. There were plenty of them who thought that the war had to be about a new vision of equality. There were others who just thought, as you know, that the war is about saving the Union, and that was really all they cared about. It just depended upon who you were. Everybody was different. But I think probably there was a critical mass, certainly in favor of ending slavery by the summer of 1863. And as Lincoln had his finger very much on the American pulse, there would be a growing critical mass by late 1864 towards a genuine vision of black citizenship. So I think that's what Lincoln was looking forward to when he made the speech. I think he had come to that conclusion, and the country would, at least by the end of the war, for the time being. The commitment wasn't there, though, for a sustained dedication. And that's the failure of Reconstruction. That's the next 10 years. But for the time being, I think Lincoln had very good reason to think that the war could mean that and should mean that. Yes, go
Right
ahead.
here.
The land that the cemetery is on, is that the estate of General Lee
Oh, no, that's Arlington.
or Arlington?
Yeah. Yeah, that's
What
Arlington
land
National
was
Cemetery.
this?
Hmm?
What land was this?
Oh, well, this was town land of the town of Gettysburg at the time. It was donated to the state and then the country.
Real quickly, were there any blacks in Lincoln's administration at
Oh, no.
some level?
No, not during his administration. There were black people close to him. He had a very favored and trusted black servant, for example. But there's nobody in the administration other than informal advisors who show up now and then, like Frederick Douglass. But no, as far as I know, no actual members of the administration. Somebody might correct me. I don't even think there were postmasters yet who were black. That would come after the war, though. Under Andrew Johnson and Grant, there were black members of the administration. Not the high levels, but lower levels. Yeah.
There were still slaves.
Well, yeah, not in the North, obviously, but yeah.
Over here next.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was the address repeated at the 50th reunion, and
Yeah.
what made it popular after that?
Well, what really made it popular was when public schools began to be the rule and not the exception in the late 19th century. They needed standard ways to teach English, and they wanted to teach people public speaking. So what better way to show cohesiveness and brevity in getting your point across, even if the point is complicated, than the Gettysburg Address. So educators thought this was a great thing to teach students, and that's how it got into readers. And from there, it got into the public consciousness, because if you were going to a public school and you were 7 or 8 years old, you read it, you remembered it. And so that's why the Music Man may remember the mayor of River City is about to recite the Gettysburg Address at the big town festival at River City. That became very common. So it started with education, and then it continued as a civic exercise in many other different contexts.
Question? Okay.
Yeah.
Is the phrase "new birth of freedom," the interpretation that you suggested, is that a interpretation that you're placing on it, or is it a consensus historical interpretation?
I'd call it a consensus historical interpretation. This is what Gary Wills said when he wrote his book on Lincoln at Gettysburg. And then I really should know this guy's name, because I stole a bunch of stuff from him about the actual text. So this one guy, oh, who is he? Well, he's better than me, whoever he is. But what he did was he went through all the different drafts of the Gettysburg Address, and he told the story of what was written when. It took him years to research this. But he was also thinking about Lincoln's thoughts at the time and what he had said to other people. And so that's part of the consensus, that Lincoln's meaning was greater than a simple wish for unity. So yeah, it's more a consensus than my own individual idea. Yeah.
This is not about the speech. I grew up in Pennsylvania. My father used to read about the Civil War recreationally, so I've probably been to Gettysburg more than anybody in this room other than you. I just want to know, is that seminary building still standing? And number two, did that become Gettysburg College then?
That's the Lutheran Seminary. It's different from Gettysburg College.
Oh,
isn't
it is? I wondered, okay.
I think, yeah, that building is still there.
Okay.
The cupola on top, at one point, that was destroyed, they had to rebuild it. But it's still the same building, it's the old dorm at the seminary.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you think Lincoln would perceive our political environment today?
Well, he would have no problem understanding two sides who couldn't really talk to each other anymore. He would know what that was like, because that's the Civil War. That's all you had to fight. You had the one thing that nobody could really talk about in any kind of a civil way, which was human slavery. And when one side decided that it was so endangered by an election that they had to leave, that's what they did. And then without any more talking, there had to be a war. I think if he were alive today, he would understand that idea of two sides that couldn't cooperate anymore, that we're now faced with. He would have searched for some way to get two sides together. He was very much into finding a language that the other side could actually understand you in. And you may not convince them of everything, but you could at least find some common ground and maybe make some incremental improvement in whatever we're faced with. He would not have lost hope. He would have tried to find, although it's very elusive, some way to communicate with the other side. My colleague at Brandeis, some of you may have read this book, John Burt, The Pragmatic Lincoln. It's a whole book about how Lincoln was always trying to find a certain language that the other side could actually understand. And the only way to do that is to recognize them as fellow thinking human beings with an agenda that you may hate, but certainly as human beings with something in common with you that you just got to find and hold on to. Maybe it's not there anymore, but he would have looked for it. He definitely would have looked for it. Yeah?
This is sort of an obscure question, but I noticed near the end it says, this nation under God.
Yeah.
And, you know, when we did the Pledge of Allegiance, famously Eisenhower added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, and he lived in Gettysburg.
Lived in Gettysburg.
And I wonder whether that's what sort of led him to think of that, nation under God.
That's a very intriguing question. The way I understand it is under God was suggested by an organization and Eisenhower just followed the suggestion, so I don't think it was literally his idea. But it certainly springs natural from the very familiarity of the Gettysburg Address. I'm sure it was in the thinking of those who wanted under God in the pledge. So I think there is a link, but just maybe not directly through Eisenhower. But yeah, he had his farm at Gettysburg. So remember when Field Marshal Montgomery went to visit Eisenhower at Gettysburg, they walked around the battlefield, and Eisenhower's impressing Montgomery with, this is where this regiment was, that's where that regiment was. And the whole time Montgomery is shaking his hand, oh, Lee and Meade, they both should have been court-martialed for this. Both of them should have been court-martialed. Typical Montgomery. No, he's not going to see the good in anything that an American does. Anybody? Well, go ahead. We have another announcement?
Just a little trivia.
Little trivia. Oh.
Little trivia. Paul Revere's grandson and William Dawes' grandson both fought at Gettysburg.
Oh.
And Revere's grandson was an officer. He died of his wounds at Gettysburg. And Rufus Dawes led the Wisconsin Regiment.
That's true.
He was one of
That's
80
right.
who survived, and his grandson became Vice President of the United States.
And there's a statue of Rufus Dawes in Madison, Wisconsin. Yeah,
And won a Nobel Peace Prize for the work that he did with Germany after World War I.
Yeah, the Dawes clan. Very good. Thank you for pointing that out. That's terrific. And thank you all
On
for
that
being
note-
such a good audience.
Quick commercial for our next month's program, Monday, February 11. This is really going to be a good program. Our own Jim Ramsey, Vietnam veteran, is going to do a program called the Dong Ha Bridge. Jim is a Seabee. His company built this great bridge, and unfortunately, several years later, the bridge had to be destroyed to prevent the North Vietnamese from infiltrating. And the story of the destruction of the bridge is worthy of a Hollywood adventure movie. So do come and join us next month and we will hear the full story. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.
Sounds like